Good morning or afternoon, and welcome to this lecture about the Commonwealth of Nations. Today we are going to look at the Commonwealth history, try to understand the background to the Commonwealth of Nations. We are also going to have a quick look at the culture, and we are going to have a bit more insight around the ideals. What did the Commonwealth really work for? Some history points. It's been said that the sun never sets on the British Empire. This was of course due to the fact that Britain, at its peak, it had colonized colonies all over the world. So, from one corner of the world to the other, there were British colonies. The British Empire was in fact seeking wealth and political power. This was, well, it was the background for all colonization power during these years. And the British Empire consisted of various territories all over the world, which were either conquered or colonized by Britain from about 1600s. It expanded by commerce, trade, colonization, and sometimes conquest. But overall, the British Empire was mainly built on commerce and not conquest. So, all around the world, colonies with different rulers were established. For instance, America was colonized by Britain in competition with Spain, Portugal, and France. And the first British colony in America was Newfoundland, which was claimed in the name of Queen Elizabeth I in 1573. However, the first successful American colony was Jamestown, which was established in 1607. So in the end, the British Empire held territories on every continent, such as Ireland in Europe, Canada and the 13 colonies in North America, Belize in South America, South Africa, Egypt, Zimbabwe in Africa, India, Malaysia and Singapore in Asia, and New South Wales and New Zealand in the Pacific. Since they had so many colonies, Britain held a monopoly on international trade for goods such as wheat, tea, tobacco, sugar, textiles, and slavery for many, many years. And Britain played a major part in the triangle trade, which saw so many Africans being shipped to a life of slavery in America. However, in 1807, the British Empire declared that shipping slaves was in fact illegal, and in 1833, all slavery in any of the British Empire's colonies ended. As I was saying, most of the British Empire's colonization was built on commerce, trading posts all around the world. And this was really due to the success of the British Industrial Revolution that allowed the British Empire to keep their grip on the colonies around the world. One company responsible for the colonial success was the British East India Company. This company colonized India for Britain and much of the Indian subcontinent, such as Malaysia, Singapore, and Hong Kong. And they really set up trading posts and factories in the different colonies, shipping produce and goods to Europe. The British colonies around the world and their resources gave Britain an advantage, both politically and economically. India was special in this matter, as it was rich with different resources, especially luxury goods, and was therefore known as the jewel in the crown. In 1858, the British East India Company was dissolved by the British Crown. Moving on. History and the fall of an empire. Independence. The 13 American colonies, they were lost to the British after the American Revolutionary War, or the War of Independence, as it is also called. And this was really the first small sign of a collapsing British Empire. What happened was that the residents in America were not happy with the treatment from the British Crown, especially regarding taxes, and therefore they revolted against the Crown. The final result was that the 13 colonies split from the British Empire and created the nation of the United States of America in 1776. In 1867, Britain gave self-governing colonies like Australia, Canada, Newfoundland, and New Zealand the status as dominions under British reign. This meant that these countries had their own navies, their own defence, but they were still in fact bound to Britain. These countries were later to become the base for the British Commonwealth of Nations, now known as the Commonwealth of the Commonwealth of Nations. So World War II was actually a breaking point for the British Empire. During the war, Britain relied more heavily on its colonies to fund the cost of war. Their influence and power in the colonies decreased, leading to several revolts and nationalist movements and revolts. Ireland was, for instance, a great headache for the British ruler as early as the beginning of the 1900s, with dark episodes like Bloody Sunday and other battles with the Irish Republican Army, also called the IRA. So, after World War II, colony after colony declared their independence. From around 1949, it was a peak, and all the way till the last overseas territory, which was Hong Kong, was given back to China in 1997. But most colonies claimed their independence in the period from 1949 and up until the 1970s, 1980s. So, the Commonwealth of Nations. The organization was formed in 1926 by Britain and its dominions. The modern organization that we see today began in 1949, but for easy reckoning we say that it started in 1926, but then it was called the British Commonwealth of Nations. The modern organization is called the Commonwealth of Nations. The head of the organization is Queen Elizabeth II, which you can see a picture of here. She does only have a ceremonial position, which means that she has no real power in the organization. The real power lies with the member countries and the Secretariat of the Commonwealth, which is located at Marlborough House in London. The Commonwealth today consists of 53 independent member states, and all of these 53 countries, except Mozambique and Rwanda, were formerly part of the British Empire. The membership in the Commonwealth of Nations is voluntary, which means that all countries participating has chosen to be part of the organization. There are, however, some demands that the members must meet to be able to join the organization. They must be democratic, and they must respect human rights. So, these countries share a common history and culture due to the fact that English culture has heavily influenced the colonies and dominions. Their parliamentary, their economic, their educational and legal systems are modelled on the British systems, which means that if you visit a Commonwealth country, you could expect to see some similarities to Britain. There are also several sports such as cricket, rugby union, rugby league, and football or soccer, which are very popular within the Commonwealth countries. And these are sports that came from Britain. Within the Commonwealth, they actually have their own Olympic Games, which are called the Commonwealth Games. Last held in Scotland, I think, this year. Most of the colonies also still speak English as their official language. And if they don't use English as their first language, it's often used as the most important second language within the country. So as for us visiting a Commonwealth country, being a tourist, for instance, we could expect to meet the indigenous culture within the country and their way of life, heavily influenced by the British culture and British systems. Perhaps you won't see anything else but British influence and culture. But that is different from country to country. Let's now see some of the ideals within the Commonwealth organization. The organization states that it works for the promotion of democracy, human rights, good governance, the rule of law, individual liberty, egalitarianism, free trade, and world peace, as they have stated in the Declaration of Commonwealth Principles from 1971. But this is difficult. These are difficult words. Let's see if we can break them up. Democracy. Democracy within the Commonwealth is very important. For instance, member countries have an equal say in all things that affects them. It doesn't matter if you're a large country with many inhabitants or a small country with very few inhabitants. You have an equal say when you are a member in this organization. Oh, sorry. The membership is voluntary, and the members can freely associate with other organizations or alliances. They have freedom to choose what would be best for their own state. So freedom of choice is very important for each country. The Commonwealth also works for international peace and order, and therefore they support the United Nations in its peacekeeping operations. The Commonwealth also believes in free trade, and that this trade should be fair and equal to all. The trade within the Commonwealth is used to support the developing countries in the Commonwealth, because there are several developing countries in the Commonwealth which are members. So they try to use trade as a means to help them. The organization also believes in international cooperation, and they believe that international cooperation is necessary for removing the causes of war. It's necessary to promote tolerance between countries and between peoples. It's also necessary to fight against injustice, and it's necessary to secure development among the peoples of the world. So under democracy, we see there are several points that is very important for the Commonwealth. The second D under ideals is development. The Commonwealth, as I said, they range from poor developing countries all the way to rich industrial countries. So the Commonwealth believes that the differences between these countries are too great to be tolerated, and therefore they seek to raise the standards of life throughout the Commonwealth by overcoming poverty, ignorance, and disease. To overcome poverty, they do trade with each other. To overcome ignorance, they have several schooling programs. And to overcome diseases, they have several medical projects going on all the time. They also work for equal rights for all and for basic human rights. The organization, they work towards personal freedom for the individual and for the individual right to have a voice in society. So freedom of speech, for instance. The last D here under the ideals is diversity. And they believe that all member states in the Commonwealth should work against racism and discrimination, and instead they work for dignity and equality between people. Their point of view is that discrimination and racism is a threat to a healthy development of the human race, and therefore we should work against it. The member states are different from each other also regarding location, where they are in the world, their race, their language, and their religion. There is a rich variety of cultures, traditions, and institutions in the Commonwealth, and to keep the diversity, to keep the different sides of the world, it's important to preserve the rich variety of culture, traditions, and institutions within the Commonwealth. So they work to preserve, they work to not lose any of the different sides with the indigenous people, like keeping the Maori culture in New Zealand alive, keeping the Aboriginal culture in Australia alive, and so on. So that's a bit of information about the Commonwealth. And my question now to you, that is there anything that you would like me to tell you more about? Or is there anything that you feel that we should discuss or talk about in class? Please write it down. My sources for this were the ones that you see. Most of it is picked from the Commonwealth organization's own pages. It's very informative, and I suggest that you actually look it up. Okay, this was it. Have fun.